Hello and welcome to another session of Clarify by ARC. And in today's session, we are going to break down the ACCA exam verbs. All right. Now, exam verbs, particularly that we are going to look at, is from the lens of SBR exam. Okay. Right. So when you get into an exam, you have to be very, very thoughtful of writing an answer for a question. And to do that, you need to understand the question properly, right? Because as highlighted in many of the past examiner reports, one of the most crucial mistakes that the students are doing in SBR exam, which is causing them to not get through that paper, is when they do not interpret or understand the question requirement. Now, question requirement understanding requires you to understand the exam verbs that are being asked from you. And you need to make sure that you respond to those exam verbs. So today's session, we will be covering what those verbs are and what are the most recurring verbs that we see in SBR. And we will be seeing that through breaking down a couple of past paper questions. All right. Okay, so when you look at an SBR requirement, so every SBR requirement usually looks like this. It has three parts. Number one is the verb. Now, in this particular requirement, you see that it says using Exhibit 1, evaluate whether the draft disclosure complies with the requirements of IFRS S2 in respect of disclosing greenhouse gas emissions metrics and targets. Now, this is a question from March-June 2026 paper. So what are three parts? Number one is the verb that is outlined here. So in this case, evaluate is the verb. Then the subject. What are they wanting you to focus on? Or what the requirement wants you to specifically work towards, right? So in this case, the subject is IFRS S2's metrics and targets. Okay? IFRS S2's metrics and targets. This is the part one, the verb, the subject, metrics and targets, and then there is going to be a scenario, meaning you have to apply what you know. Now, this is what the knowledge requirement is, but you will not be able to respond to the question well if you do not apply that knowledge to the scenario given, right? So those are the three requirements or three parts of a requirement of SBR. Number one is the verb, understand what the verb means. Number two is going to be the subject, get to understand or get to know what the subject requires you to do. And number three is the scenario. I've already covered in one of the sessions I conducted in the past where I focused on how the subject becomes crucial or important. Now, in this case, this requires you to focus not only on IFRS S2, because if it's IFRS S2, subject could be governance, it could be risk management, it could be strategy, it could be risks, the metrics and targets, right? So subject could be anything there. But here they are specifying it's IFRS S2's metrics and targets. So that is what the subject is, and your focus need to be around that, looking at what the verb wants you to do. Right. So when you look at the verb, there is a ladder that you have to understand. There's a verb ladder that you have to understand. Okay. First part of the ladder or the first step of the ladder is where you are supposed to state the fact. When the verbs are list, define, state, or identify, we'll be looking at what they mean. All right. Then second step of the ladder requires you to do the work, meaning if these verbs come in, you will have to do the work. Verbs such as calculate, apply, prepare. So you have to do this work. You have to calculate. You have to apply. You have to prepare. So that work is supposed to be done. Third step of the ladder is to make it clear, right? So in this case, if these verbs are used, you need to make sure that you bring in more clarity, reasoning, justification, right? So describe, explain, interpret, illustrate, summarize. These all require you to make it clear. Then the fourth step. Now, these are the two steps that are very important because SBR focuses or SBR lands on these two steps, right? An SBR candidate is supposed to land onto these steps. All right. So fourth is weigh both sides, meaning you have to bring both the sides and you have to bring a proper weightage around it. So verbs such as compare, contrast, discuss, analyze, assess, evaluate, when these verbs appear, you have to bring both the sides of the argument. Okay. And then fifth step of the ladder is where you have to land a decision. When the verb is conclude, recommend, justify, or advise, here you have to bring out your decision. Tell what you think should be done, right? When you're supposed to conclude, bring a conclusion. Recommend, give your recommendation. Justify, bring your justification. And advise, meaning you have to bring your opinion out there. Okay, those are the 5 steps of the ladder, the verb ladder in SBR. Number 1, state the fact. Number 2, second step is where you're supposed to do the work. Number 3, you are supposed to make it clear. Number 4, weigh both the sides of the arguments. Number 5, you have to land a decision. Right. Now, tiers 1 and 2, the steps 1 and 2, right, which require to state the fact and do the work. Let's look at what those verbs actually mean. List, meaning you have to itemize. When the verb says you to list down, you have to itemize it. Right? Clearly bring all the elements. Bring all the items that are relevant. That's how you list it down. Then define. You give the precise meaning, definition, right? You don't go into excessive detail. Rather, you limit yourself to the definition. What do targets and metrics mean in IFRS S2? Define targets and metrics. When someone says, or the question says, define targets and metrics in under IFRS S2, you have to define, bring a clear and precise meaning. No need to go into detail. Then state and identify. So state is where you have to provide a clear and concise explanation. Clear and concise explanation, right? State something, right? And identify is where you pinpoint the issue, right? You're not going to explore that issue. Rather, you pinpoint the issue. If the verb says you to identify, you just identify it, right? Pinpointing the issue is necessary here. And then calculate is where you determine numerical values using mathematical methods, right? So you have to use mathematical methods in order to determine numerical values, meaning bringing in numbers here, right? I always tell my students to follow the CACS method: knowledge, application, calculation, and then the spreadsheet. When it comes to question 1, there's no spreadsheet. CAC method, the knowledge, application, and calculation. Now the calculation requires you to bring in numbers, right? Use mathematical methods and determine the numerical values, right? So in this case, now calculate is a verb which would give you or get you marks even for the methods, which is why you have to show workings always. When calculate verb appears, you have to show the workings, because even the workings and the method also gets marks, and that this is where own figure rules apply as well, right? And then apply and prepare. So apply is where you run the standard against these facts, right? So you're applying, bringing in the knowledge of the standard and applying it to scenario, right? Look at the scenario, look at what's a relevant standard requirement, bring that requirement, apply to the scenario. That's what apply means. And prepare is where you're supposed to produce the answer in a certain format, right? Maybe in a report format, maybe focusing on a certain audience. If they ask you to focus on the investors, you have to focus on the investors' perspective. Okay, how it's going to affect the investors. Creditors, lenders, focus on their perspective. So that is where you're supposed to prepare, meaning preparing requires you to produce the answer in a certain format addressing a certain set of audience. Okay? Right. Then the third step of the ladder, or the tier 3, which requires to make it clear, right? This is where the explanation is required. Describe, you set out the features in detail, right? Each one developed beyond a bare noun, meaning you have to describe it now, right? You bring the feature and you bring detail, or you describe what that feature means as well. Explain, you make a concept clear and understandable to your audience, right? Clear and understandable is key. When you're explaining something, you are required to make something clear, make something understandable. And to do that, how will you be able to do that? When you show the why, right? When you bring in a fact, standard requirement, consequence, you bring that to your to bring that understanding out. That's where explanation happens. All right. That's where the clarity comes in. All right. Then interpret, say what the numbers mean. Now, in interpret, you are required to tell what the numbers mean, right? Okay. Now, when you talk about a ratio in terms of an analysis, right, of financial statements, now you can tell that current ratio has changed, right? Or quick ratio has changed. Okay. So you're just saying that, right? You're not interpreting. How would you interpret it? Where you say, because the current and quick ratio have changed, the liquidity position of the company is impacted favorably or unfavorably. That's where you interpret the numbers now. Has the change affected favorably or unfavorably? And what part of the company is affected? Liquidity. All right, that's where interpretation comes in. Then illustrate, prove the point with a figure or a fact from the exhibit. Right? Supposed to prove the point with a figure or fact from the exhibit, right? You need to bring in a concrete example. Now, when you read the scenario and the question verb requires you to illustrate, you are going to prove what the question wants you to by bringing in the facts and figures from the scenario itself, right? You bring in examples from the scenario itself. The application part also is required here, meaning you have to apply whatever it is to the scenario. Okay. Then summarize, condense to what the reader needs, right? Condense to what the reader needs without bringing too much of information. If you bring in too much of information, that's not summarizing, right? So you need to be brief. When you're summarizing something, you have to be brief, you have to be concise, and you have to bring only what is necessary for a reader to understand, right? If you bring in too many information or too much information, reader will be overwhelmed, right? Just like the annual reports out there. You have annual reports with 300, 400 pages, right? Not everyone reads all of that, right? If I am a finance professional, I am an auditor, I'm a bank, I'm a lender, I would just focus on the financial section, a financial analysis. Yeah. So summarizing is where you bring concisely or condense to what the reader requires to understand. Okay. So these are the verbs where you are supposed to make it clear, meaning go beyond into explanation. Then you have tier 4 where you are supposed to weigh both the sides, and this is one of the verb section or tier where SBR questions are going to be focusing on. Right, so SBR's life is on tier 4 and tier 5. Okay, right. Compare. You have to show how the items relate through similarities, right? Meaning points of connection. When they ask you to compare, you don't bring in opposites. You don't bring in dissimilarities or differences. You bring in similarities. You bring both the sides and show the similarities there. Okay, that's where you're supposed to compare. Contrast is opposite of compare. Now you bring in differences, not similarities, right? So in contrast, you avoid similarities and focus on the differences of both the sides. Compare, focus on similarities, not the differences. Contrast, focus on differences, not the similarities. Then you have the discuss, which is the most heavily used verb, which requires you to argue both sides on the scenario's fact, right? Talk about one side, meaning good side, side that is not too good, based on the scenario, and then you have to bring a clear view, right? You have to take a position there. You have to take a stance, right? And bring out your opinion, right? Now, when we go into the past paper questions, we'll understand and we'll see things through practical application better. All right. Right. Then you have analyze. Now, this is where you break it into parts and show what drives what and how they connect. Right. So, two things, you break them into parts, show what drives what, how these two connect, and what are the interrelationships and underlying principles in both of these. Okay, that's what analyze requires. Then assess requires you to weigh strengths against weaknesses, right? You look at the strengths, you look at the weaknesses, weigh both, right? And then you look at both the positive and negative aspects within the scenario, right? You look at the strengths, weaknesses, and both positives and negatives. Okay. Then evaluate. This is where you bring in advantages, disadvantages, risks, opportunities, and a conclusion. Now, when it's evaluate the exam verb, conclusion also carries a mark, right? So you need to conclude. we'll look at what of the verbs require conclusion as well. Right. Then comes tier 5, where you're supposed to land a decision, show your decision making ability, show your stance, show your opinion. Right. That's what these verbs are going to focus on. Number 1 is conclude. This is where you're supposed to reach a clear, decisive judgment. Right. Now, in this case, you can't say it depends on scenario or circumstances, because the exhibit is given to you. The scenario is given to you. You can read the scenario. You can understand the situation. Now, on top of that, you can't, when conclude is what is required from you, you can't say it depends on scenario, circumstances. You have to come to a decision. Look at the scenario, look at the circumstance, look at the exhibit, and arrive at a conclusion. Okay? Right. Then recommend. This is where you have to say what should be done. Right. Now, you can't speculate also. When you are recommending, you can't speculate. You have to recommend, when you have to tell what needs to be done by looking at what has happened, what the exhibit says, what the scenario says. Based upon that, you have to recommend what needs to be done in a way which can be acted upon. It cannot be superficial also, right? It needs to be a recommendation that can be done immediately, right? You can't bring in something that can't be done at all. All right. Then justify. This is where you link the decision to the given facts, right? Link the decision to the given facts. Now you're justifying your decision. You made a decision, right? Now you are trying to prove why you made this decision based on the scenario itself, right? You bring in the reasons, or you give the reasons for your decision. Okay. Then advice. This is where you are supposed to provide expert guidance to a named recipient, right? In order for them to make well-informed decision. If you're supposed to advise to an investor, bring clear guidance, or give expert guidance or opinion to that particular party or that particular stakeholder. All right. So these are the 5 steps of the verb ladder. Right. Now, which verbs need a conclusion? Remember, when the verb is evaluate, conclude, recommend, advise, conclusion is always required. Okay. And conclusion also carries marks. And then discuss also in practice in SBR questions as per examiner's requirement, examiner report, examiner perspective. You need to take a stand. You need to take a position. Right. Now, that is where conclusion is necessary here as well. Okay. A balanced argument that never resolves is not going to get you marks. Okay. So evaluate, conclude, recommend, advise, discuss. When these verbs appear, conclusion should come into your mind. You have to conclude, right? You quickly, when you're drafting an answer, when you're planning an answer itself, quickly put a conclusion part, underline it, so that you don't forget to conclude. All right. Then assess, summarize, interpret may require to conclude depending on the requirement. So here you are supposed to read the requirement properly. Okay. So here the requirement requires you either to conclude or not to conclude. So here you have to read the requirement. Okay. If requirement wants you to conclude, conclude. If requirement doesn't want you to conclude, don't conclude. So that's assess, summarize, interpret. And never conclude, list, define, state, identify, calculate, describe. Never conclude it. You're going to waste your time. Not going to get any marks here. So do not waste your time by bringing conclusion here. Okay. Right. Now, for example, there are 2 examples that you see here. A weak answer, which decides nothing. Whether the account is a cash equivalent depends on the circumstances, and the directors will need to consider IAS 7 carefully. Right. So this summarizes, does not choose. There's no decision being made here, because here they are leaving it at circumstance. But circumstance would have been given, right? You have to just read the requirement or read the exhibit and understand it. Yeah. Then when you take this example, it is not a cash equivalent. 4 months exceeds a 3-month maturity guide, and there is no contractual right to early termination. Present the deposit as an investing outflow and the interest as an inflow. Now, this is where you are taking a position. You are deciding, right? You're showing the consequence, right? Okay. So make sure that when a conclusion is required, this is the style of answer that is required from you. Okay, right. Now, in case you're running out of time, we're short of time, and when the verbs are either of these, where conclusion is necessary, conclude before finishing the argument. Bring the conclusion, then you finish the argument. Okay, time's up, stop, move on. All right, okay. And then you have to decode, right, before you plan it. Now, if you look at this example from March, June 2024, using Exhibit 1 and in accordance with IAS 21, explain why Normstra Co's functional currency is NY. Now, the examiner is already telling you that it is NY. You have to just explain why it is NY. Now, you can't tell if, let's say, there's another currency of dollar that's given. You can't go ahead and say that NY is not the functional currency, dollar is the functional currency. You are going to get penalized. Why? Because the examiner clearly asks you to explain why NY is the functional currency. So stick to the requirement. Okay. So they are not asking you to discuss whether NY should be the functional currency or not. If discuss comes in, then you can take both the sides. But here they're asking you to explain why Normstra's functional currency is NY. Then you have to explain why it is NY. Don't focus on anything else. Okay, because the answer is given to you. You just have to explain through the scenario and through the knowledge, the standard knowledge application. All right. Okay, so that's what's important. To understand the verb, understand the requirement, decode what it requires you to do, and then you bring your answer plan. Okay, because when they ask you to why, examiners have concluded in their examiner report that it is not something you have to debate on. Okay, right. Then let's look at some uh, examples, right? Okay. Question number 1. Now, this is from March, June 2026. Question 1A. It's a 13 marks question from Shebay Group, right? The step acquisition of Lodge. Now, what does this say? Explain with calculations the correct accounting treatment of the investment in Lodge in consolidated financial statement, including a calculation of any goodwill arising on 31st December. Calculation, explain. When it's explained, no conclusion required. Okay, so explain, make it understood. Say why in a chain, the rule, then these facts, then the consequence. Meaning you bring the knowledge, then you apply it. And calculation, you have to calculate, right? You have to bring the calculation. When calculate part comes in to the verb or the question requirement, you have to make sure you show the working. You show the method, because method also gains marks here. Okay, right. So make sure you don't just give calculations, right? Explain why, and then with the calculation. So when you're explaining, explain with the calculation itself, right? Don't just explain without calculation. Explain with calculation. Don't provide just calculation. Explain calculation with explanation. That's what's important. And do not provide conclusion. They are not wanting you to conclude it. Okay, you're going to waste your time if you go on to conclude. All right. Then comes the second question from March, June 25. Question 2A. Right, so by float co. In accordance with IFRS 9 financial instruments, discuss the accounting treatment. Discuss the accounting treatment of the transactions in Exhibit 1 in the financial statements of buy float for the year ended 31st December 2027. Right, discuss. Now, when it uses discuss, you are supposed to examine an issue, weigh both the sides, bring both the sides in, right? So you have to weigh both the sides. When, again, remember, weighing both the sides comes in when it asks you to discuss whether, right? Now here they are asking you to discuss the accounting treatment, right? Not discuss whether this is or this is not, right? When it is discuss whether or whether it's not, then you have to weigh both the sides, right? But here it names the treatment, or it gives you the treatment itself, right? It asks you to discuss the accounting treatment of the transaction. So you have to discuss the accounting treatment. Do not bring in both the sides here, right? Because here they've given you a couple of scenarios about three situations. So you bring all those three situations and you discuss. Okay. All right. Right. So it wants you to take each transaction in turn and reason it out under IFRS 9. Okay. Now that's where the difference. Now discuss whether required to weigh both, bring a conclusion, discuss the accounting treatment. You have to discuss each accounting treatment or each situation given in the question. Third question, Hicks go. Does the draft comply with IFRS S2? Right. So evaluate whether the draft disclosure complies with the requirements of IFRS S2 climate related disclosures in respect of disclosing greenhouse gas emissions, metrics, and targets. Evaluate is a verb. Draft disclosure is the requirement, right? Whether the draft disclosure is complying or not, right? That's a scenario. And what is the subject? Okay, greenhouse gas emissions, metrics, and targets. Greenhouse gas emissions, metrics, and targets. Right now, here you are supposed to evaluate. Now, what you do here? Judge how good something is. Now, what do you do? In this case, both the sides. Areas that comply, areas that do not comply. You bring them, explain them clearly, right? And then bring a conclusion. Okay, conclusion is necessary. Why? Because evaluate whether draft disclosure complies or not. So you have to make a conclusion whether is it complying or not, right? You speak about both the sides and give a verdict. Okay, right. Then question 4. Now this is where critically assess is being used. Okay. Now critically assess is where you are supposed to assess from both the sides again, giving more weightage to what is not good than what is good, right? When they use the critically assessed term, critically requires you to be a critique, look at things that are not good, not favorable, not positive, give more weightage to that, but talk about both the sides. That's what this requires. So weigh something's worth by looking at strengths and weaknesses together, but focus on what is not favorable more. All right. Okay. Right. And then they are being very clear. They are saying how it's useful for investors. So you have to limit your assessment, or you have to focus your assessment towards investors. It should be from investor perspective. Whether investors are being benefited or are they not? Right. Whether companies being benefited or not is not the question. Whether lenders are being benefited or not is not the question. Whether investors, is it useful for investors or not? Is this disclosure of judgment useful for investors or not? Right. So you have to talk from investors' perspective. And when you talk from investors' perspective, that is where you get professional marks. This question carries professional marks. That professional marks is given if it is spoken from investors' perspective. Okay, right. Then comes the fifth question, Jota Ko. Right. So identify and explain the ways in which statement of profit or loss does not comply with IFRS 18. Now again, they are saying the ways in which profit or loss does not comply. Right. They're not asking you to look at the areas that comply. Rather, identify the areas that do not comply and explain why they do not comply. Right. Take down the situation from the scenario. Look at what are the areas that are not compliant with IFRS 18. Right. That's where your identifying comes in. Explanation is you explain, okay, why is it not compliant? So that's where you bring in the standard application, standard knowledge. Okay. Right. And explain any amendments which the financial controller should make. Right. Then and explain any amendments that should be made. So you see, one question requirement has multiple sub requirements, right? Identify what does not comply from IFRS 18 perspective and explain why you identified that does not comply, right? And explain how this should be amended for it to become compliant. That's what the requirement decoding is. Okay. Identify how it does not comply, explain why you identified that and how the amendment should happen. Explain how the financial controller should amend this so that it becomes compliant. That's what the requirement says. Okay, so identify is where you pinpoint and name it. Explain, make it understood. Okay, Right. Then question 6 from June 26th, question 2B. Hicks score the email from the Chief Sustainability Officer in that question perspective. Discuss the ethical issues which exist in relation to the email from Arancha and any actions which James should take to resolve this. Discuss actions. Okay. Discuss the ethical issues, actions James should take. Now, this requires you to examine the issue and develop it against the ethical code of conduct. Okay. Right. So you have to look at the ethical issues, many problematic areas. Okay. The problematic areas, you take that and you discuss from the perspective of what is problematic. Why is it wrong? How would you see why is it wrong? By applying it against the ACCA's code of conduct. Okay. So discuss, and then what are the actions James should take on top of the issues identified. All right. Okay, so these are the 6 questions focusing on 6 different types of verbs being tested in different ways. Now let's go back to the verb ladder. Okay, so discuss, you see, it does not always require conclusion, but you have to look at the balancing of the argument and you have to take a stand. Okay, right. So you go back, land a decision. So these are the key verbs, right? Discuss, argue both sides on the scenario's facts when it talks about whether, but if it's just discuss, focus on what it wants you to discuss. Okay? Right. So take a position and clear view there. Evaluate advantages, disadvantages, risks, and opportunities, right? These are most important and most recurring verbs that you see in SBR. And assess, weigh strengths against weaknesses. Critically assess, weaknesses should take the lead over actual strengths. All right, so that's critically assess. The different assess and critically assess. Assess, weigh them equally. Critically assess, weigh the weaknesses more stronger than the strengths. Okay, right. And then you have conclude, recommend, justify, advise, which requires you to land a decision. Okay, so these are the most common verbs that we see in SBR. And we also have seen how it applies to different questions, 6 different questions. All right. So remember, verb sets a stage or sets the shape. Every mark has 2 halves, right? One is going to be for the knowledge or principle. One is going to be for the application. So again, marks could be dependent, right? Some would carry more heavier marks for application than knowledge. Some would give equal marks for both. But remember, every question would have marks for knowledge and application. Okay. And when you are answering breadth over depth, right? Focusing on one area in deeper is not a good idea. Focusing on all the areas concisely or at a surface level is better than going deeper into one area. Okay, that's breadth over depth always. And the conclusion is important where it is required because that also carries marks. All right. Okay, so that's to do with the exam verbs in the context of SBR. Make sure you read the requirement properly, you understand what the requirement says, and address what the verb wants you to address. All the best.